Miriam Borden is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. She holds a BA in Jewish Studies and an MA in Yiddish from the same university. Her research interests are in the development and evolution of Yiddish as an ethno-linguistic identity of the organized institutional life in the Jewish community of Toronto in the post-war period. Does that sound good?
So far, yeah.
Okay. She is also the 2020 winner of the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here.
So one of the things that you had to do in order to win this prize was to write an essay. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And that's what we're going to have a look at. It's entitled Building a Nation of Little Readers, 20th-Century Yiddish Primers and Workbooks for Children. But before we get into the actual meat of the collection, let's have a little chat about the prize itself. It was established by Heather O'Donnell and Rebecca Romney, and they are looking for a book collection conceived, built, and owned by a young woman in the US. I guess, does that include Canada? It must.
It doesn't actually. I was lucky in that because I still have, an address in the US and ties to the US, and for all intents and purposes, I am an American transplant here in Canada. I was lucky that I fit the bill.
Okay. And you have to be 30 or younger.
I turned 30 earlier this year, so I'm just American enough, and I'm just young enough.
Okay. Now, I guess what they're looking for in the essay is the story of your collection?
Yeah, they are interested in, first of all, what it is that interests me about this collection. They're interested in the origin story of the collection. They're interested in my collection practices. What is it that I look for in books that I choose to add to that collection? And ultimately, I think, what do I feel the impact of such a collection really is in general in the world? And that's what I tried to sort of outline in that essay.
Well, I love the way you begin it.
I tried to paint a picture.
Faded cloth covers, peeling spines, frayed edges, splitting seams, stained end papers, vulgar doodles, and scribbles effacing every page. Can you expand on that, please?
Sure. The books in my collection, I would say the majority come from a school that is no longer in existence. It was called the Workman Circle School. The Workman Circle, now called the Workers' Circle, is a historic organization. They're over 100 years old. They were sort of founded as a political-cultural organization based in the Yiddish language and based around Yiddish culture. I believe they were founded in New York around the turn of the century. And once upon a time, they grew to have the most expansive Yiddish school system in the United States. There were also a few branches elsewhere. Canada was one of those places, and Toronto was one of those cities. So when they sold their building in Toronto last winter, it was December 2019, I offered to help them clear out because I felt sad that such a historic institution was closing its doors. And I should say that they haven't closed their doors, they've just relocated. But the idea that, they were selling this building that was built for them, for nobody else, there hadn't been a building there before them, The fact that they were selling a building they had inhabited and had built themselves and had inhabited it for, more than half a century, I found that really sad. And I wanted to do what I could. This is it's not only my collecting interest, but it's sort of my life interest in general. Is the history of Yiddish. And so I thought I should be there and sort of be around to either help pack up boxes or take away whatever they didn't want. And I was right to suspect that there would be a lot of stuff they didn't want. And among those things were books. Books take up a lot of space. It's not that they don't want the books, it's just that there isn't a place to store them. As a bibliophile, you probably know that. And especially, this becomes a real problem for books that in general, not many people can read. what is the purpose then of purchasing or renting storage space for books that nobody, not even that they're not going to read them, they can't read them. And that's because they're in a language that nobody can read anymore, right? So this is a problem for Yiddish books. It turned, I had mentioned to the director of the Workman Circle here that I was interested in pedagogical materials because I teach Yiddish. So I'm interested in the history of Yiddish pedagogy, and let's just call it what it is. I'm a nerd.
Right.
And not only do I want to know, I want to find better tools to teach the language myself, but I'm interested in how did people before me approach the teaching of this language, right? So he, knowing this, put aside certain books for me that he came across. So I showed up there every couple of weeks, and he had another stack of children's books for me. And then in addition, over the years, various people who themselves are either selling their homes or downsizing from a 4-bedroom house to a condominium are looking to get rid of Yiddish books. Often these include their own school books when they were children in the Yiddish school system. And somehow or another, they will find me. I'll hear about these books. And usually I'd like to see, what is it that they have that they want to give away, and is it something that I'm interested in?
What's the somehow or other?
By virtue of being a young person studying the Yiddish language, I guess there's an imaginary list that your name sort of appears on. There aren't too many of us, right? And so whenever somebody's looking to get rid of Yiddish books, there are sort of a number of people locally who are usually contacted. There are various means by which this happens. So sometimes, professors of mine will say, "Oh, Miriam, I heard about these Yiddish books. Are you interested?" Colleagues or friends of mine at the Ontario Jewish Archives who know that I work with Yiddish will contact me and tell me, "Oh, I heard about these books. Do you want to maybe get in touch and see what it is?" So it's sort of like that. Word of mouth, I suppose, is the best. It's word of mouth, really.
You may well be unique. There aren't that many people doing what you're doing, collecting what you're collecting.
That's true. There are many bad reasons for that, but there's one good reason, I think, for that. And the good reason is that it's an interesting time to be collecting Yiddish books in this way. And what I mean is, 40 years ago, around 1980, somebody just like me, a young graduate student studying Yiddish, founded what's now called the Yiddish Book Center. It's this incredible, it's a repository for Yiddish books. It is a museum. It is a bookstore where you can buy, these authentic archival copies of Yiddish books. They are a kind of research think tank. They're a translation house. They're all these things. And they've really become the central address for Yiddish books today.
Are they in Amherst?
They're in Amherst, Massachusetts, yeah. And they're a remarkable institution. If the Yiddish Book Center didn't exist, I would have a lot more Yiddish books on my hands. They are a place that at this point, it's been 40 years, people know about them. So when you're looking to get rid of, a few bookshelves of Yiddish books, usually if you don't already know about the book center yourself, you ask somebody like me and I will tell you, well, you can send them to the Yiddish Book Center. They're always accepting books. There's a feeling, and the people at the Yiddish Book Center, I have spoken to them about this and they agree with me. There are some books that have a sense of place about them that you don't want. Not all books need to go to the Yiddish Book Center. And that's something that I believe, that's something that they believe even. They're happy to take, orphaned books that have nowhere else to go. But I sort of believe that there are some books that deserve to stay in the places where they come from, because they are a part of the fabric of that history in that place. I guess what originated as just an interest in historic pedagogical materials for children has now sort of become a bit of a broader project, which is to really document and preserve, to whatever extent I can, the history of Yiddish education and therefore sort of Yiddish culture by extension in Toronto, which I have found, not for lack of effort, but has not really been well preserved in many ways. In some ways, sure, many archival documents and so much more have found their way to the Ontario Jewish Archives, which has sort of become, if you're looking for Yiddish documentation, for example, that's going to be that's your first stop.
Yeah.
Otherwise, though, where do you go? There isn't really anywhere else to go. The universities have also become places where you can find Yiddish books, documentation, films, newspapers on microfilm, things like that. But these are all archival institutions, right? Libraries or archives. I do believe that these things, they still have a relevance. They don't need to be enshrined, behind glass somewhere. They have a relevance, I think, in our everyday lived lives. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to do is hang on to that that relevance, the material, aspect of that relevance in whatever way I can. And it's a limited way, I'll admit, but I'm doing my best.
Well, it sounds to me, first of all, though, you had this desire to reignite the Yiddish language or re-enliven it, let's say. Is that right? That sounds like a very early desire of yours.
I spent my entire life in Jewish day schools, in modern Orthodox Jewish day schools in New Jersey for 18 years. And then for a year, I studied in Jerusalem in an institution there. During that entire time, really almost without fail, I don't think I heard a single Yiddish word. And that is remarkable to me.
Yeah.
And shocking.
You grew up with it, right? Your parents thought it was important to maintain?
Actually, no. My grandparents, who are both Holocaust survivors from Poland, Yiddish was their native language. And so I heard them speak to each other in Yiddish. My mother, inherited the language from her parents informally. She didn't go to school. For many people my age, Yiddish was for me sort of a heritage language, the language my grandparents spoke, the language everybody's grandparents spoke. But there was very much a generational element to that, right? That it was the language of your grandparents and your great-grandparents, if you knew them.
Yeah.
And really not your parents, our parents. So these are our parents, for the most part, baby boomers, so maybe slightly younger. Our parents are people who might have heard the language at home, picked up a few juicy curse words, but that's about it. And then, of course, the language becomes filtered with every successive generation, right? And to the point where, my peers largely have no knowledge of Yiddish whatsoever, except for what they have the Yiddish that is sort of returned to them through things like Hollywood, films, the theater, just American comedy, right? American English, schmuck and putz and schmooze and all those things, in a way that Yiddish has sort of returned to people of my generation through those channels. But what I found really striking about that, the older I got and the more I learned, was that Yiddish is so elemental to Jewish life, even when it's not there. So even though I heard no Yiddish among my peers, from my teachers, when I began to study the language, which really, I should say, was really a fluke. I arrived at Rutgers University in New Jersey, 19 years old, and I was looking for courses and I saw they were offering Yiddish, and I thought that was kind of entertaining and interesting. And I thought, well, I already know Hebrew, so this should be a breeze. And it wasn't. It's nothing like Hebrew.
Okay.
But the more I learned the language, and the more I learned about the language, the more I saw that this was a huge gap. Why didn't I know more about the world of Yiddish? It's a language that's 1,000 years old. It is the language of modern Jewish history. So I'm talking about the history of the Jews from the 18th century and onward. Where did the Yiddish go? What happened to it? And so, yeah, so as you say, I sort of took it upon myself to not only to reignite it, but to rediscover it. There was so much to me that we didn't know. I'm now doing a PhD in the subject. There's still so much we don't know. So part of the journey it's an adventure. It's a treasure hunt,
So you mentioned in your essay that it was a result of the Jewish state of Israel that Hebrew was adopted as sort of the Jewish language rather than Yiddish. Why is that?
That's an excellent question. And it's a historical question. What people tend to describe as sort of the decline of Yiddish, and I don't know if decline is really the right word, but let's say, increasing invisibility of Yiddish in the post-war period, let's call it that, really is due to a number of factors. It's not only the rise of Hebrew, although that's part of it. After the Second World War, and the Second World War was a war in which 6 million Yiddish-speaking Jews were murdered, right? So we're not just talking about a loss of Jewish life, we're talking about a real loss of Yiddish. And after the war, Yiddish was increasingly seen in these terms of loss. When it was invoked in a context of nostalgia.
Of pain, too.
Of deep pain and tragedy, absolutely. And in fragments, too, right? Because you're talking about a vernacular, not just a language that's spoken, not just a culture, a language that is spoken that permeates all of life, every dimension of life, all of a sudden shattered.
Is it a kind of language that, is it correct to draw a parallel between Yiddish and Joyal in Quebec as a kind of a slang in comparison to a sort of more proper French language?
It's a great question. The answer is certainly no, but I will say that the fact that I can say no so decisively is kind of sort of a relatively new thing. If you're talking, it's about 150 years old, but that's new in the context of 1,000 years. What I mean is there was a time, certainly, right around what I mentioned, sort of the beginning of what we think of Jewish modernity. We're talking about the 18th century, especially into the 19th century. There was a sort of school of thought. I should say that these people were they were German Jewish intellectuals. These are Jews who thought of themselves as enlightened, who really did begin what we now call the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which is a 19th century sort of, has been described as sort of a romantic movement. It's an intellectual movement. The idea was that now in this new landscape of enlightened Europe, Jews can be citizens just like anybody else. To be citizens, they must have sort of an identity, a national identity. And there's this idea that now this was possible to actually craft this identity and shape it in the way that it needed to be shaped.
Herder, was it?
Yes, they were really influenced by Johann Herder, the German philosopher, the 18th century philosopher. The big idea that I guess that emerges from his writing is that language is the soul of a people, and language contains the peoplehood of a people. And you can see that in the people's writings, and you can see that in their philosophy, and you can see that in their art. Well, Yiddish is a language. And so for many of these intellectuals, for some of these intellectuals, Hebrew was the answer. Hebrew was going to be the language that would catapult Jews into sort of a modern identity. Why Hebrew? Because it had history. It was the ancient language of their forebears. It was tied to place. It was tied to Zion. It was the language of ritual. It was the language that had followed the Jews in their exile for 2,000 years. There are very good reasons to think that Hebrew is the answer. Others, though, looked around and said, well, we're all speaking Yiddish, though. Yiddish is the language we live our lives in. Hebrew is for ritual. Hebrew is, you could call Hebrew Latin, but we're all speaking Yiddish. So why not elevate Yiddish? And that's the sort of, I guess, the intellectual turn that modern Yiddish culture comes from. They really invested themselves in building up the Yiddish language through literature. Literature became of prime importance. And that's when when historians date, when we talk about modern Yiddish literature, we're really talking about literature that bursts into being in the, let's say, 1860s. It's not to say, the oldest printed Yiddish we have dates to the beginning of the printing press. People were printing Yiddish as early as they were printing anything else. In manuscript form, we have Yiddish from around 1270.
Again, why did Hebrew ascend and Yiddish decline then?
That fast forwards us a little bit to the post-war period.
You did answer that question, didn't you? It was because it was associated with the pain of the Holocaust primarily. Is that
it's partly that.
Yeah.
What you end up having as the 19th century melts into the 20th, you end up having these twin sort of literary heritages, I guess, Jewish literary heritages. You have Hebrew on the one hand, which is really a language of intellectuals. They're sort of crafting from this ancient Hebrew, they're crafting a modern Hebrew. And that's really for intellectuals. Most people are not reading Hebrew. And that's the reason these other Jewish intellectuals turn to Yiddish. They say, well, very nice that I can write in Hebrew, but nobody's reading my stuff. Right. So they turn to the vernacular, and that's when Yiddish popularity just explodes. As we're in the First World War, we go into the interwar period, we go through the Second World War. Hebrew and Yiddish are sort of these twin pillars that are both evolving in parallel and also in intersecting ways. You have many writers who most, in fact, of the greatest Yiddish writers began as Hebrew writers and turned to Yiddish, thinking, and this answers your question from before, they began as Hebrew writers under the assumption that Yiddish was what they called a jargon. It was a jargon.
Yeah, I think there is a parallel between
there is.
And okay.
There was, I should say, there was. And this was how most people thought of Yiddish, as something you speak at home with your parents, and you see this in almost every one of these intellectuals, what you did if you were a 19th century male, you wrote an autobiography at some point. And in almost every one of their autobiographies, which I should say are all written in Hebrew, although they had illustrious Yiddish, careers, right? Their autobiography was written in Hebrew. They all recall the sort of early moment in their childhood when they were living in Yiddish at home, they heard their mother speak Yiddish. It's always their mother, I should also add. There's a gendered element to this too. It's always the mother. And they would sit and their mother would be reading her Yiddish books. And then they grew up and they learned Hebrew. That was sort of, it's that something that you grow out of in the 19th century conception, right? And so in the meantime, there's a political side to all of this, right? It's not just aesthetic. There's a political element to all of this, which is that Yiddish becomes sort of the language, or conceived of as the language of the diaspora. So it is not a language that has borders. It is a language of Jews everywhere in Europe. Hebrew becomes sort of really centered, especially with what they call the first aliyah, the first sort of move, the first immigration to mandate Palestine happens in the 1880s. There's another wave in the sort of around World War I. There are successive waves. So Hebrew becomes more established also and becomes really tied to, historic Israel, Palestine, and then later the state of Israel after 1948. And so there becomes a huge investment, not only in building up Hebrew, but in almost denying the validity of Yiddish in favor of Hebrew. You end up sort of with the ideologues say, you can't have both. We must put all of our efforts into building up Hebrew, because Hebrew, again, language, nation, peoplehood, if you want to have a real independent Jewish nation, it's going to have to speak in Hebrew. That becomes one political element. Others completely disagree, and it is this really others believe you can have it all. You can speak in Polish, you can speak in Russian, you can speak in German, you can speak in Yiddish, you can speak in Hebrew, you can speak in all of these, in fact. And it's really heated, and it is really passionate and diverse. And then the Second World War happens. And so many of these conversations are frozen in time, or completely, or just cut short and never revisited, especially because after the war, Yiddish is now contending with the dominance of Hebrew, which, as the state of Israel established in 1948, there is so much brain power and money poured into the development of modern Hebrew, the development of the new Jewish state, that certain parents of children in Jewish schools begin to argue, we really shouldn't be teaching Yiddish to our children. We should be teaching them Hebrew. If we want to arm them to be modern Jews in the world, we should arm them with the language of their country, right? Namely Israel. Even if these are students, children in America or Canada or Argentina, it doesn't matter where. So you begin to see Hebrew really take over at the school level. It doesn't mean Yiddish schools don't exist anymore. Yiddish schools do exist. They exist into the 70s, in fact, and there are still Yiddish schools today, I want to also say. So it doesn't go away, but it is definitely outshone by the presence of Hebrew in these schools. The other thing is that, Yiddish becomes associated with pain and loss. It is a symbol of what is old. And if you want to be new, you don't speak Yiddish anymore.
Is it like kind of the elite, the professional classes versus the working classes? Is that a split or not?
It's a great question. No, it's not even a class issue after the post-war period. It's more all-encompassing than even, it's not just about class. It's about Jewish identity. It's about the fact that to be a modern and productive Jewish citizen, you should know Hebrew. And that sort of that really takes over for the majority of people.
Okay. So let's get back to the vulgar doodles.
Yes.
Kids rarely take good care of books. And you make a beautiful point about the fact that seeing all of their marginalia is sort of watching the language being learned, the process of it being learned. It might be a bit of a stretch, but I think that's the point you make, isn't it?
Yeah, that, when you read children's books or the material that children were using to learn a language, right? It's different. It's not exactly literature, but, part of the same universe, I guess. Kids leave behind evidence, that I was here. Not so many words, but they leave behind evidence of their usage, of their presence on the page in ways that adults don't. We're a little bit more, we hold back. We may write a little note, we might underline, maybe highlight. Kids are unbridled, and they want not only to let you know they were here, but they want to leave their mark. They want to leave their own mark, in fact. And that's what I see in so many of these books. Yeah. They're the books kids were using in school. These are schools, and I think this is important to remember. These are supplementary schools. You never went to a Yiddish school. I'm talking about the 40s, the 50s into the 60s. Yiddish schools are supplementary schools. You went to Yiddish school after you came home from normal school, or you went to Yiddish school on the weekend. What kind of torture is that for a kid? What kid wants to be in school?
Now,
Another
this
school.
focus too, right? The 40s and the 50s to the 60s. Those are the years that you focus on, correct?
Those are exactly the years that I focus on. These are the years that the books, to me, are most aesthetically impressive, narratively a little bit more sophisticated. Some of the earlier texts don't even really have a narrative. They just go about teaching the children the alphabet letter by letter, with objects, visual objects that start with that letter, right? So in the 40s, the 50s, we begin to see books that are built around, there's a plot. It's a loose plot, but it's a plot. You have characters, sort of the Yiddish Dick and Jane, right? And you have their mother and their father, and you have the baker, and you have their dog, and the baker and the dog and the mother. Everybody speaks Yiddish, even the dog. And you have this entire world that is then fashioned in Yiddish. It's a sort of fantasy world where children are well behaved and polite, and they don't get in trouble, and they're very helpful, and they ask intelligent questions,
They're
and
models. They're models.
Exactly. And yeah, so I focus on that period for those reasons. Aesthetically, well, I guess there's one more reason. There's the aesthetic reason. There is the sort of narrative sophistication of books from this period. And there's also the fact that they are historical artifacts that really tell us so much about what it was and what was that negotiation of being Jewish in the post-war period. And we're really talking post-war America, because most of these books are produced, actually, I should say all of these books were produced in the United States. So,
well, I mean, the fact is, as you say, the language had been forgotten. And so this is evidence of the fact that it was once thriving, and that there was an effort to educate the next generation so it wouldn't die.
There are also books that, to me, and even at the moment of their production, there's one perspective, sure. There's one set of glasses that we can view these books through from our perspective now, right? Looking back, 50, 60, 70 years. There's also the historical perspective of that moment. And I think even the books in the moment they're produced they contain a kind of anxiety. They contain the anxiety that this language, it's not quite lost yet, but we need to ensure that our children speak and know the language. And therefore, in that way, we will ensure the continuity of not just our language, but our culture. And I think, and these books contain that anxiety. These are books, of course, they're produced for children. They're produced by adults. And the adults, I think the anxieties of the adults are right there on the page.
Okay, so at the time, there was very much a feeling of urgency or anxiety that the language itself was disappearing, and the educators, the publishers, the parents were all motivated to produce the material that you collect. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the language was still very much present in these people's lives. It wasn't that the language had quite disappeared yet. They were just really concerned that it was going to. And part of the reason they founded a Yiddish school system to begin with, and then began to produce all these materials for use in those schools, was because they wanted to do everything they could to ensure that the language didn't disappear. Ensuring the continuity of the language ensured their own continuity, right? And so there's a real, these are books produced for children, but they're produced by adults. And the concerns and the anxieties of those adults are mapped out right there on the page.
Give me some specifics of that then.
Well, I explained that some of these books have more of a narrative to them. The narratives are contained within two settings, the home and the school. These are going to be where children experience Yiddish, right? It's not just that this is a narrative device. This is actually the reality of where children are experiencing Yiddish. They're growing up. These kids are born in the US. They're born in Canada. They're born wherever they're born. They are Canadians. They are Americans. They are playing baseball. They're going to the park with their dog. They're doing the things American kids do. And they're doing all that in English, right? They are native English speakers. What these books try to do is readjust the perspective of these kids, that they can live that life in Yiddish.
Right. So it's kind of a parallel existence then.
Absolutely. And what ends up happening is, the school really becomes, I think, in these books at least, the school becomes where Yiddish happens. Yiddish happens a little bit at home because your parents speak Yiddish, but Yiddish really happens at school. There's an intersection at so many points in these books where school and home are almost indistinguishable from each other. So, for example, there's one really memorable scene in a book that I believe is from I want to say 49. It's Hanukkah. It's the holiday of Hanukkah. And the child lights the menorah at school with the teacher. The teacher explains the holiday to the children. So they learn about the holiday in school in Yiddish, right? They light the menorah. So there's that actual the enactment also. There's the performance of that identity, not only learning about it. Then the next scene is they go home and the child asks his father, Daddy, I lit the menorah in Yiddish. Daddy, I lit the menorah in school. I'm old enough to light it at home. And the father says, no, you're not. And he says, but I learned it at school. I did it at school. And it's sort of, it's like a mini dramatic scene where the child proves to his father that he does know how to light the menorah and he can do it at home. So that in that moment, school and home, they're almost the same place. And your parent and your teacher sort of meld into one, adult figure who teaches you the ways of Yiddish. And it's moments like this and they appear constantly. They really do. They're everywhere.
So is this an observation from the books and ephemera that you collected, or is something you knew before that?
This is something that I have observed just from carefully reading these books. And, there isn't much in the way of content. They're very, they're simple. They're like any other children's, reading primer. So they're, the children go to school. The children sit in school. They're very repetitive, right? The children go to the park. The children go home, things like that. And in carefully reading these books, reading them, not only the text, but reading the images too, and looking at the interplay of the images and the text. What are the messages being sent and what's between the image and the text? That's what I, as a careful reader of these books, have teased out.
Okay. So you got going then when you were at Rutgers studying Yiddish, that right? Is that where the light bulb went on and you became a collector?
It's interesting. No, I think I became a student of Yiddish at that point in my first Yiddish class. And then it's interesting. I don't know. I think to some extent, every student of Yiddish becomes a collector of Yiddish. And this has to do with the fact that it's such a small community, relative to students of other languages. It's a small community. It's very intimate. We call it the Yiddish world. It's a very small world. And it is very easy. I want to emphasize that it is very easy as a student of Yiddish to come across a collectible Yiddish book. They're everywhere. And this is part of the tragedy and the joy.
What do you mean everywhere? Everywhere, where?
Today, and I mean, we're at a moment when Yiddish is in many universities. You can learn Yiddish at the university level around the world at this point. This wasn't really the case 40 years ago, or even really 30 years ago. This is really an innovation of the last 20 years and in earnest of the last 15. Yiddish is at so many universities. They're very small classes, but the fact that Yiddish is now sort of been enshrined in the academy like this means that there are people who are interested in preserving the material culture. There are people, and there are places, in fact, and this is what's really important, there is space and there is funding to support these programs, which are programs to encourage the education of students in the language, but also the preservation of the language itself.
Paid to collect?
I wish, if only. No, I don't get paid to collect. And you might even argue that what I do collect is basically worthless. I was supposed to, at the same time that I was sort of collecting, children's books from this Workman Circle building that I mentioned earlier. I mean, that's just a fraction of what they had. They had books of all kinds. I was only collecting the children's books. And the other books, they had no storage solution at the time. They do now, and the books are safely in storage in Toronto, but they didn't have anything anywhere else to put them. So I was actually trying to plan the shipment of these books to Amherst, to the Yiddish Book Center, because there just wasn't anywhere else for them to go. And I remember that at the Yiddish Book Center, they wrote me a letter that was going to be a customs declaration that I could hand to customs that basically said, this truck of books I have is completely worthless. There's nothing of value. Trust me. There are thousands of books and none of them is worth anything. So it's a collection that I treasure, but that is, monetarily worthless.
I know all about that. I want to get a handle on when you actually became a bona fide collector.
Hmm.
And then you say the stuff is everywhere. Well, if it was it around the time you went to Rutgers? And then what did you actually do to start your collection?
You know, it's a great question. It's difficult for me also to pinpoint the moment this happened. I suppose the moment this happened was the first time I agreed to take, someone was clearing out their bookshelf, or their grandfather's bookshelf, or their father's bookshelf, and had nowhere to put the books. And I said, you know what, I'll take them. And it was probably in the last couple of years. I would say maybe even 2 or 3 years ago,
Yeah.
probably in my graduate work, that really happened. And I think it's because at that moment I had learned enough, I'd studied enough, I'd seen enough of both the Yiddish world and the world at large, that I realized this was something vulnerable that I had an opportunity to protect, to save. I don't know if before that it would have had such resonance for me. I don't think I would have really seen the importance before that. And I think it's also the moment, I think that coincides at the moment I became a teacher of the language as a graduate student.
Yes. You saw a practical application.
Absolutely. And my evaluation of the language really changed, because now I wasn't simply a sponge for the language. It was my job to pass that on to other
Yeah.
students. And
Yeah.
I think that also really changed my perspective of the material value of these things. In
Because they were
addition,
tools.
they were tools. Exactly. I found they were useful to me.
Yeah.
And so initially I actually collected them in order to gain a historical perspective on what is the trajectory of this pedagogy. How would students learn Yiddish in a classroom in the 1920s? How did that evolve? How might I take some of these tools and use them in my classroom today? So it actually began that way.
And what works best.
Yeah, what works best
Yeah.
and what is still applicable, because
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
it's been 70 years. What is still applicable in the 2000s to students of Yiddish?
So I was very interested to see in your essay that very early on, or maybe about halfway through actually, you said, I cataloged the collection. That's so important.
Mm. That is really an allusion to another Yiddish book project that I worked on that is really parallel to, but separate from my collection of children's material. And what I mean is, it was really at the same time, in the same 12 months that I was collecting Yiddish children's books, that another historic Yiddish institution in the city reached out to me and said, it's the standard script. We have a bunch of boxes of Yiddish books. Would you like them? And as usual, I said, well, what are they? And this was the first time that they weren't able to tell me. They said, we don't actually know what's inside the boxes because nobody here can read Yiddish. And this
Uh,
was, right, that's when I said, what do you mean nobody can read Yiddish? This is an organization. It was the old communist holdout. It was where all the communist Jews belonged. It was a fraternal organization from the 1920s through the 50s, and even beyond, actually. Communists and then later just generally leftist Jews belonged to this organization. It was an institution. It was a Yiddish institution in the city. And I thought, how is it possible these people can't read Yiddish anymore? What happened? And originally they had said, we have 10 to 15 boxes. Would you like them? And I
right.
said, well, 10 to 15. I looked at my garage and I said, I could probably fit 10 to 15 boxes. And this, I should say, this was the largest collection anyone had ever offered to me. But of course, I wanted to see the books first. I wanted to know what they were. Because they couldn't tell me what was in the boxes, I made an appointment to go and see them myself. This is pre-pandemic, of course. And not by the time I could make a date, it had been a few weeks, I showed up and there were like 40 or 50 boxes. And I said, I thought you said 10 or 15. And they said, well, we did, but we found more. Later on, it turned out there were not 10 or 15. There were not 40 or 50. There were over 100 boxes. And what I counted to be probably over 2,000 books. So what we're actually talking about is not a small collection. We're talking about an entire library, and nobody knew what was inside. So I assembled a team of volunteers, friends, colleagues, just people I knew who could read Yiddish. I said, if you can read Yiddish, come
You're
here
in.
on this date at this time. You're in. Yeah, you're one of us now. Bring a pen and paper, bring a computer. I don't care. We only have the summer because the boxes are housed in what's now a Montessori school. So they're in session during the year. This is in the summer. I said, we only have the summer and we have 2,000 books to get through. And we went through and we started cataloging. And the collection was vast. And yes, there were children's books, of course. because this place also had a Yiddish school, right? There were translations of world literature. So if you want Gogol or Tolstoy, Thomas Mann, or you want Guy de Maupassant, or you want Romain Rolland, you want anybody, any illustrious writer, let's say the luminaries of the 20th century, 19th, 20th century, everybody was there in Yiddish. There was Bambi in Yiddish. There was, you name it, they had it. Philosophy, history, Jewish history, politics.
I mean, you're after children's books, but you volunteered to do this cataloging for them of all the books that they had. Is that right?
Yes. They're not necessarily interested in giving them all away. They're interested in writing the next chapter for these books, right? Whatever that next chapter is going to be, we needed to know what was in the boxes. We needed to know what these books were and what, if any, relevance they had. So I thought, I don't know anybody equipped to do this job. I don't know anybody with the time or the skills to do this. So I thought, well, I'm that person. Let me see what I can do. In the process, yeah, I inherited many of their children's books, so that added to my collection, and I went looking for those as we were cataloging. But I also inherited, I don't know, tens of other books, interesting, rare copies of things that I hadn't seen before, or just interesting additions to my bookshelf that were unlike normal Yiddish collections. This was all packed away in these boxes. It was the contents of several Yiddish libraries in the city of Toronto that over time had sort of consolidated into one, and that one somehow found its way into these boxes and then was forgotten. So it was an incredible discovery, and it's an unfolding story. We don't know how it ends yet.
Okay. So your collection is then primarily composed of primers and accompanying workbooks. Is that right? 20s through the 50s kind of thing?
Yeah, and even into the 60s and 70s, yeah.
And you look for detailed illustrations, ink stamps that announce the school's alignment with a particular movement and marginalia.
Mm-hmm.
So you love the marked up books, contrary to most collectors.
Yes, I love the marked up books. I like the books where you can tell people really use them, real people. I'm interested in books that have a voice, and I think the voices come through in the marginalia, in the book stamps, in the checkout dates. You can really tell that these were part of a dynamic exchange of Yiddish books once upon a time. And I can relive that exchange in some small way through these instances of marginalia.
You've also got mimeographed booklets and zines of songs, grammar exercises, and short poems.
Yeah, this has to do with, I think, the sort of the breakdown of the Yiddish school system, where you still have these Yiddish schools. They operated more as community schools in the later years, and I'm now talking about the 70s and even into the 80s, in fact. And today, they operate more as community schools. And sometimes they're Sunday schools. They tend to be really fun, a lot of singing, a lot of dancing, a lot of plays. This was always a characteristic of the Yiddish school system, but I think, in some ways, the language and the education of the language has really been, it's very limited to these things. It doesn't mean it's any less rich, but there just aren't as many venues for children to, experience the language, right? So their entire experience of the language as they're learning it happens in school and in these fun ways. What ended up happening was you go from having all the adults in the room are native speakers of Yiddish, you go to having like some of the adults in the room be native speakers of Yiddish. And some of those adults became really tenacious and said, well, sort of like me, I don't know anyone else who can do this, so I'll do it. They became the teachers in some of these schools and took it upon themselves to create updated material. They couldn't, they didn't have the money anymore. They didn't have the infrastructure to get it published as a real book. So they mimeographed it or they Xeroxed it and they stapled it together, and that became the workbook. So in some ways, I guess my collection documents actually the school movement, right? From its days as a place where you could get, real books published, hardcovers, cloth bound, to a place where you're going to get a Xeroxed workbook with a staple in it.
Right. So toward the end of your essay, you indicate that your collection comprises 17 cloth-bound hard books, 24 workbooks, dozens of mimeographed booklets, songbooks, and short plays, and 3 sets of vocabulary flashcards. That's not a huge collection. I guess I was under the impression, just from what we've talked about to this point, that you had a ginormous collection, but no. So did you use a criteria to kind of pare it down?
It's a great question.
You say that after every one of my questions. I love that.
You have great questions. What can I say? And they're hard questions to answer. Maybe it's that I don't know how to answer them. I guess the world of Yiddish books is vast, and that is true. That's the impression I've given you, and it is because it is true. The world of Yiddish books is vast for reasons of history, for reasons of ideology. It's a vast world of Yiddish publishing. Yiddish children's books, equally vast. I suppose, yeah, you're asking me if I pared it down. My focus is really specific, actually. I have a razor sharp focus, which is pedagogical materials. There is also an adjacent world of children's literature, right? Yeah. Stories for children. Some of these are being updated in new editions now, in fact, and re-released with commentary, academic essays and things. So there is a whole world of literature. I really was interested in the Yiddish school. And the reason I was interested in the Yiddish school and the kind of materials children would encounter in the Yiddish schools is because there is so little evidence of those schools left. That's what really drives my collecting sensibilities. It's that these are material evidence of something for which we don't have much else evidence. Part of what I have, in addition to my books, is the huge wooden signs that, this is not really a part of the essay or the collection, but I have these huge wooden signs from the old Workman Circle building that have in Yiddish and in English. There's a bilingual sign that has the phone number you can call if you want to sign up for classes, what kind of classes are offered. It was a huge hand-painted sign on the front of the building that was going to the dump. And I would not let that happen. So I have that sign. I have 3 signs, in fact, huge wooden signs. I don't know what to do with them. They belong in a museum, really, but they're in my garage. And so, yeah, because to me, those signs also, like these educational materials, they're all we have left, especially now that the buildings themselves are being sold.
Yeah, I was going to say, the proof, evidence, preservation, these are all key.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're the driving force behind what you're doing.
I think any minority language has these existential concerns,
Yeah.
It's built into the fabric of what it is to speak and know the language. Is you're concerned about, well, who's going to speak it and take it over for me when I'm gone. And I think that is built into Yiddish in a way. Every language has this in some ways. Yiddish really has that.
You say something beautiful here. You talk about the China having been shattered, the silver stolen by the Nazis, that the language is the only heritage that you have.
It's an heirloom. Exactly. It's an heirloom. And that's why it is so important to me. I think if we had to figure out what is the reason that I do this, it's because it's all I have from the people who came before me. I can go back to the city my grandparents came from in Poland. They came from Lodz. I cannot find their address because the building doesn't exist anymore. I cannot go to the municipal offices and find their records because there are none. What I do have, and one way for me to access that past, is the Yiddish language, and whatever is left, behind, whatever that language leaves behind.
Yeah.
Whether that's song or poetry or books themselves. So the books themselves become so important for that reason.
So what's the end game? What's your dream for what you're doing?
Well, what I would really love is more and more and more centers for Yiddish books, like the Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts. I would love more of those. I would love smaller local satellite versions of those, because I think what I have found in my travels, in my studies, is that there is almost no place in the world you can go and not find at least one Yiddish book, usually more. The smallest little community will have some Yiddish books. It's staggering. And I think centralizing all these books in one place, it's great to have the infrastructure, it's great to have the staff, it's great to have the resources. I would love to see that happen in smaller versions, though, everywhere these books exist. Because, like I said when we first started talking, some of these books have a sense of place. And displacing those books from the places of origin,
Yeah.
there's a loss there to me. There's a loss that really can't be replaced.
So how do people get a hold of you if they've got a ton of exactly what you want?
They can drop me an email. They can visit my website, which is discoveringyiddish.com. There's a contact page. Please drop me an email. I'm interested, I should say, not only in the books, I'm interested in the stories behind the books. I want to know how these books were used. I want to know who used them. I want to know what place they hold. You know, if you've held on to them for decades, I want to know why. That's part of the story of these books. So I'm interested in those as well.
That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Well, let me say that I think that Honey and Wax settled on a fantastic winner. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on the book and exemplifying what I think collectors should shoot to be.
Nigel, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
Miriam Borden is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. When do you expect to graduate?
Another 3 years or so. I have 3 years of funding, so let's call it 3 years.
Great. Well, best of luck with that.
Thank you so much.